The house was so big that footsteps echoed even when only one person walked through the hallway. Marble floors shined like mirrors, chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and expensive paintings covered the walls. From the outside, it looked like a place where nothing could go wrong. A place built with money, power, and success. But inside, the air felt heavy, filled with silence and fear. The billionaire had everything most people could only dream of. Businesses across countries, cars worth more than houses, and respect that made people bow their heads when he entered a room. Yet none of that mattered anymore. Not when his only daughter lay weak in a quiet bedroom upstairs. She was still young. Too young to understand why her body had stopped listening to her. Doctors came every week, sometimes every day. Some spoke with confidence, others with careful words. They all promised effort, but none promised hope. Machines beeped softly beside her bed. Medicines sat on the table, changed again and again, each one failing in silence. The billionaire spent most of his nights sitting beside her bed, holding her small hand, feeling how cold it had become. He had bought the best hospitals, flown in the most famous doctors, and paid for treatments people only read about. Still, every morning felt worse than the last. His daughter smiled less, her voice grew weaker, and fear slowly took over his heart. Downstairs, life continued as usual. Staff moved quietly, speaking in whispers. Everyone knew the truth, but no one dared to say it out loud. Among them was a poor maid. She wore plain clothes and simple shoes that had seen many years of use. She arrived before sunrise and left after sunset. Most people barely noticed her. To them, she was just another worker, someone whose name didn't matter. Her job was simple: clean the floors, wash the dishes, wipe the furniture, and leave no trace behind. She had worked in many houses before, rich houses, cold houses. She knew how to stay invisible. That was how she survived. But this house felt different. There was sadness in every corner. The maid felt it the first day she entered. She noticed how the staff avoided the upstairs hallway, how voices dropped when the child's name was mentioned, how even the billionaire, a man feared by many, walked with tired shoulders and empty eyes. One afternoon, while cleaning near the staircase, the maid heard a soft sound. It was not loud, but it was painful. A weak cough, followed by a quiet cry. She paused, holding her cloth tightly. No one else reacted. The guards stood still. The staff kept moving. It was as if they had learned to ignore it. The maid looked up toward the stairs. She had been warned never to go upstairs without permission. That floor belonged to doctors and family only. Still, something inside her felt uneasy. She did not move forward, but the sound stayed with her. Later that evening, as she cleaned near the kitchen, she noticed a small tray being carried back untouched. The food was still warm. The maid asked another worker quietly why it was not eaten. The worker only shook her head and said the child had no strength left. That night, when the house grew quiet, the maid stayed behind a little longer. She wiped the dining table slowly, listening to the silence. Her thoughts kept going back to the weak cough she had heard earlier. It reminded her of something from her past, something she tried hard to forget. She had grown up poor, in a place where hospitals were far and doctors were rare. Illness was faced at home with care, patience, and small remedies passed down by elders. She had seen sickness closely. She had watched people suffer. She had watched people heal in unexpected ways. The next day, the billionaire returned home early from work. His face looked more tired than usual. He barely noticed the staff greeting him. He went straight upstairs. Minutes later, raised voices echoed through the house. Doctors were being questioned. Answers were demanded. None satisfied him. The maid stood in the hallway downstairs, holding a bucket of water. She could hear everything. The fear in the billionaire's voice was not the voice of a powerful man. It was the voice of a father losing hope. Later, as the staff gathered near the kitchen, the maid overheard them talking. The child's condition had worsened. The doctors were running out of options. Some believed there were only days left. The words fell heavy like stones. The maid felt her chest tighten. She kept working, but her hands moved slower now. She wondered how a child could suffer so much while surrounded by so much wealth. She wondered how money could fail where love and care were needed most. That evening, something unexpected happened. One of the nurses accidentally dropped a folder near the stairs. Papers scattered on the floor. The maid rushed forward to help. As she picked them up, she noticed medical notes, charts, and unfamiliar words. But one thing caught her attention. The symptoms described felt familiar. Too familiar. Her heart started beating faster. She remembered someone from her past, someone she had cared for when everyone else had given up. The memory was painful, but also filled with strength. She returned the folder quickly, saying nothing. That night, the maid did not sleep well. She kept thinking about the child upstairs. She replayed memories, old nights spent sitting beside a weak bed, small hands gripping hers, waiting for morning. She knew she was just a maid in a billionaire's house. She knew no one would listen to her. Still, her heart refused to stay silent. The next morning, while cleaning the hallway near the stairs, she saw the child's bedroom door slightly open. A nurse stepped out, wiping her eyes. The maid froze. For a brief moment, she saw the child lying still, eyes half open, breathing shallow. That image stayed with her all day. She worked quietly, but her mind was racing. She was not thinking of money or job security. She was thinking of a child fighting a losing battle. She was thinking of how sometimes hope comes from places people least expect. As evening approached, the billionaire came downstairs to sit alone in the living room. He stared at nothing, his hands clasped tightly. The maid passed by, carrying a tray of water. She slowed her steps. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say something, anything. But fear held her back. Who was she to speak to a man like him? Who would believe a poor maid over trained doctors? She walked past him without a word. But after a few steps, she stopped. She turned around slowly, her hands shaking. The billionaire looked up, surprised. No one ever interrupted him like this. The maid opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them felt heavy. She lowered her head and apologized, then walked away quickly. But the moment past did not disappear. The billionaire watched her leave, confused. Something in her eyes had caught his attention. It was not fear. It was concern. Real concern. That night, the house slept uneasily. Upstairs, the child's breathing grew weaker. Downstairs, a poor maid lay awake, knowing that her life and the lives in that house were about to change. Even if no one realized it yet, fate had quietly stepped inside the mansion, and it had chosen the most unexpected person to carry hope forward. The next morning, the house felt unusually quiet. Even the guards, who usually stood with stern faces, seemed tired. The staff moved like shadows, whispering to each other about the child's condition. The billionaire stayed upstairs for hours, pacing the corridor outside his daughter's room, checking her monitors, and listening to every shallow breath. The poor maid started her day as usual. She cleaned, scrubbed, and polished, moving silently through the rooms, but her mind was elsewhere. She could not stop thinking about the child. That weak cough she had heard the day before, repeated in her memory, haunting her. She had seen that kind of suffering before, and she knew it was not something that could be fixed with money alone as she went about her work. She noticed small things that others ignored. The little bedsheet that had shifted slightly. The blanket that covered only part of the child. A small toy dropped carelessly on the floor. Most people would overlook these signs, but she paused, studying every detail. She understood that these small things mattered to someone so weak and fragile. During the mid-morning, she saw the child's nurse rushing out of the room, her face pale. The maid waited until the hallway was empty, and then approached quietly. She stopped at the doorway, glancing in. The child was lying there, eyes half closed, breathing shallowly. The maid's heart sank. She wanted to do more than clean and serve. She wanted to help, to comfort, to do something that might make a difference. But the rules of the house were strict. A maid was not allowed inside the child's room without permission. Still, she found herself lingering, watching, wishing she could do something. She remembered the nights in her village, sitting beside someone she had cared for when sickness had taken hold. She remembered holding a small hand, whispering words of encouragement, giving warmth, and sometimes finding a small remedy that brought relief. She wondered if she could do the same here. As she moved back to her chores, she noticed the billionaire standing by the stairs. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded curtly and went upstairs again. Something in that brief look made her heart race. She realized that he too was desperate, searching for hope where none remained. Throughout the day, she continued her cleaning, but her mind was restless. She started observing the child from the hallway, noting every change in breathing, every small movement. She noticed that when the child's eyes flickered, there was a faint color returning to the cheeks. She also noticed that the child seemed to respond when someone spoke softly. Even if that someone was just passing by evening, she could not hold herself back anymore. She approached a nurse quietly and asked in a soft voice if she could spend a few minutes in the room to tidy and organize the things that were scattered. The nurse looked at her skeptically. "You cannot go in there," she said firmly. But the maid insisted, "Please, I just want to help with small things. I won't touch anything medical. I just want to make her comfortable." The nurse hesitated, but the desperation in the maid's eyes reminded her of something long forgotten: care and empathy. With a cautious nod, she allowed the maid inside. The room smelled of medicine and antiseptic. Machines beeped quietly, monitoring every small change in the child's body. The maid moved slowly, arranging the blankets, straightening the sheets, and picking up small toys. She whispered gentle words, not expecting a reply. But the child's small fingers twitched slightly when the maid's hand brushed a loose blanket into place. It was the smallest movement, but it filled the maid with hope. Days passed like this. Each day, she spent a few minutes in the room, unnoticed by most, but observed by the billionaire from a distance. Slowly, he began to trust her presence. He saw that when she was around, the child's weak eyes would open a little more. Sometimes, the child even tried to smile. The maid did not know it, but she had started forming a connection. The child sensed her kindness and calmness. Doctors were puzzled, nurses whispered about it, and the billionaire watched in disbelief. The child, who had been unresponsive most of the time, now seemed to react to the maid's voice. The little moments of care mattered more than any expensive medicine had. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the windows, the billionaire approached the maid. He spoke softly, almost hesitantly, something he had never done before. "I see what you are doing," he said. Do you understand her condition?" The maid nodded carefully. "I have seen something like this before," she said. "It is hard, but small things can make a difference. Comfort, warmth, attention. Sometimes the heart matters more than the body." The billionaire looked at her, a mixture of disbelief and hope in his eyes. No one in the medical team had said that. No one had suggested that care alone could help. Yet he could not ignore what he was seeing. The child was responding, however slowly, to the maid's presence. From that day onward, the billionaire allowed her to spend more time in the room. She did not touch the medical equipment or interfere with treatments. She simply stayed, quietly speaking, arranging small things and giving the child comfort. And slowly, the child began to respond more. Eyes that had been dull started to shine faintly. Small smiles appeared, fleeting but real. Weak hands tried to reach out. The staff noticed the change. Some whispered doubts. "It's just a coincidence," they said. But even they could not ignore the fact that the child's condition seemed a little less severe. When the maid was near, the billionaire began to observe her closely. He had never trusted anyone easily, not even the people he paid thousands to. But there was something different about this maid. She did not care about money or position. She did not flinch at the grandeur of the house or the power of the people around her. Her focus was entirely on the child. One night, when the house was silent, the billionaire found himself outside the child's room watching. The maid sat on a small stool beside the bed, holding the child's hand. She spoke softly, telling stories, humming tunes, and brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. The billionaire felt a strange mixture of awe and gratitude. He realized that he had been blind to something very simple, yet very powerful. The following days, the routine continued. The maid spent time with the child, noticed subtle changes, and provided comfort. Doctors remained cautious but puzzled. Nurses whispered among themselves, and the billionaire, who had once relied only on wealth and authority, began to understand that real hope sometimes comes from the most unexpected people. It was during this time that a bond began to form between the maid and the child. The child, once fearful and weak, started responding to gentle words and soft touch. It was a slow progress, but real. The maid learned the child's habits, the small things that brought comfort, and the tiny signals that indicated pain or discomfort. She was no longer just a maid. She had become a quiet guardian, a presence that brought warmth to a room filled with machines and fear. Even the billionaire could not ignore it anymore. He began asking the maid questions, seeking her opinion. He realized that experience, compassion, attentiveness could sometimes matter more than years of study and the most expensive treatments. And in the quiet of the mansion, a new hope began to grow, fragile yet persistent. Carried by someone who had nothing but her heart to give, the days passed slowly, each one blending into the next with the same rhythm of beeping machines, whispered conversations, and quiet footsteps on marble floors. But the air in the mansion had changed slightly. There was a flicker of hope where before there had been only despair. It was small, fragile, but it existed. And it was carried by the presence of the maid, who no one had expected to matter. One morning, after the sun had barely risen, the maid was tidying the child's room as usual. Her hands moved carefully, arranging toys, straightening sheets, and making sure the child was comfortable. She noticed the monitors were reading slightly better numbers than before. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but she saw it. A tiny sign that maybe, just maybe, her small efforts were helping. The child opened her eyes faintly and looked at the maid. There was recognition, a spark of awareness, a flicker that had been absent for weeks. The maid smiled softly, leaning closer without touching anything that belonged to the medical team. "Good morning," she whispered. "Did you sleep well?" The child tried to answer but could not find her voice. She moved her small hand toward the maid, and the maid gently held it, feeling the weak squeeze. It was enough. It told her that the child was still fighting, still clinging to life. The billionaire, who had been watching from a distance, stepped inside quietly. He had begun to trust the maid, although he could not understand why a simple worker could make such a difference. He watched as she spoke softly, moved calmly, and brought comfort without any expectation. There was no arrogance, no pretense, just genuine care. Later that day, she was cleaning the corridor outside. The maid overheard a conversation between two nurses. "Nothing is working," one whispered. "Her condition is worsening." The other sighed. "We've tried everything. Doctors are at a loss." "I don't know what to do anymore." The maid's heart tightened. She had seen despair like this before in her village, when doctors and medicine had nothing to offer. She knew that people gave up when hope seemed impossible, but she also knew that sometimes hope came from simple acts, from knowledge that could not be found in hospitals or books. That evening, when the house was quiet and the child slept, the maid sat alone in the kitchen. Memories she had buried for years came flooding back. She remembered someone from her past, a little girl with the same illness, whom she had cared for when everyone else had given up. She had no tools, no wealth, only hands, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. She had nursed that child with small remedies, gentle care, and unwavering attention. Against all odds, the child had survived. The memory was painful, but it also gave her strength. She realized that the same methods might help this child, even in a mansion filled with technology and wealth. Her heart raced with both fear and hope. She was just a maid. Who would listen to her? Who would let her try? The next day, a sudden crisis hit. The child's breathing became irregular, her body weak, and monitors began to beep frantically. Doctors and nurses rushed in, adjusting machines and checking charts. The billionaire's hands shook as he stood by the bed. For the first time, Fear fully overtook him. He realized how close he was to losing his daughter. In that moment, the maid stepped forward quietly. She had prepared herself mentally, remembering every lesson from her past. She spoke softly to the nurses, suggesting small adjustments not to medicine, but to the way the child was positioned, the warmth of the blankets, the rhythm of breathing exercises she had learned long ago. The medical team paused, unsure. They had never heard of these methods before. The billionaire looked at her, disbelief and desperation in his eyes. "Do it," he said simply. "Do whatever you think can help." The maid approached the child carefully. She adjusted the blanket, spoke softly, and gently guided the child's weak movements. Hours passed with her sitting beside the bed, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort, and making sure every small detail was perfect. She remembered every lesson, every moment from her past experience, and applied it with precision and care. By morning, the child's condition had stabilized slightly. It was not a miracle, but it was progress. The monitors read better numbers. The child's color returned faintly, and her breathing grew steadier. Doctors and nurses watched in awe. The billionaire felt a mix of relief and disbelief. How could a poor maid, someone they all underestimated, achieve what they could not? From that day on, the maid was allowed more access. She was no longer just cleaning or tidying. She became a part of the care team, though unofficially. She watched, observed, and applied her knowledge carefully. She was cautious not to interfere with the medical procedures. But her presence brought comfort and stability that no machine or medicine had. The bond between the maid and the child grew stronger. The child responded more, trying to speak, to reach out, and even to smile faintly. The billionaire began to see something he had never understood before. Compassion, experience, and genuine care could sometimes achieve what wealth, power, and medicine could not. He started trusting her judgment, asking her advice, and observing her carefully. In the quiet moments, when the house slept and machines hummed softly, the maid shared small stories with the child. Tales of her village, simple stories about courage and hope, and quiet words that made the child's eyes light up. She used small remedies she remembered from her past, simple techniques that soothed pain and anxiety. And slowly, the child began to fight back, showing signs of life that had been absent for weeks. The billionaire watched all of this, unable to fully comprehend it. He had lived a life of power and wealth, believing that money could solve everything. Now he was learning a different lesson, that sometimes true power came from the heart, from patience, from someone willing to stay, quietly and tirelessly, beside those in need. Other staff noticed the change too. Some were skeptical, but many could not deny the improvements. The child, once lifeless and unresponsive, now had moments of awareness and small signs of strength. It was subtle, but enough to bring hope. The maid never spoke of herself. She never asked for recognition or reward. Her only focus was the child. She understood the risks, the disbelief she might face, but she did not care. She had faced hopelessness before, and she had learned that sometimes the smallest acts could save a life. And so, the mansion, once filled with silence, fear, and despair, began to feel a little lighter. Hope returned quietly, carried by someone who had nothing but her heart and experience to give. And in that hope, the child's fragile life began to fight back. Slowly and painfully against the odds, the billionaire, watching this transformation, realized that the maid was not just helping his daughter survive. She was teaching him something invaluable, that love, attention, and genuine care were sometimes stronger than the richest medicine and the most advanced technology. And in that quiet understanding, a new chapter in all their lives began. One built not on wealth or power, but on trust, compassion, and the simple human desire to care for another life. The days grew longer, filled with the quiet rhythm of the mansion and the soft hum of machines. The child was improving slowly, each day bringing a little more strength, a little more awareness. But with progress came tension. Every small improvement was fragile, every smile temporary, and the fear of losing her remained in the billionaire's eyes. The maid continued her routine, moving quietly through the rooms, always alert to the child's condition. She had begun to understand patterns at times when the child felt pain, the moments when she became restless, and the tiny signs that indicated a sudden change in her health. No one else noticed these things, but the maid did. She adjusted the blankets, whispered soft words, and spent long hours simply holding the child's hand. One afternoon, a sudden complication arose. The child's breathing became shallow again, and her pulse dropped slightly. Doctors rushed in, checking monitors and giving instructions. Machines beeped frantically, signaling alarms that echoed through the quiet halls. The billionaire, who had been pacing outside the room, froze in panic. He had never felt this helpless in his life. The maid stepped forward immediately, her eyes calm but focused. She assessed the child's position, adjusted the pillows to relieve pressure, and whispered instructions to the nurses on gentle movements that could ease discomfort. The staff followed her advice hesitantly, but the changes were subtle, yet effective. The child's breathing stabilized, and the pulse slowly returned to a safer rhythm. The billionaire watched, astonished. He realized that her knowledge, drawn from experience and care rather than textbooks, had made the difference. That night, the billionaire sat outside the room, unable to sleep. He had never been one to admit vulnerability, yet he felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the maid. She had become a silent protector of his daughter, someone he could rely on when the world had failed. He reflected on his life, realizing that despite all his wealth and power, he had never encountered someone with such pure intent. Meanwhile, the maid sat beside the child, holding her small hand. She whispered softly, telling stories to distract her from discomfort. She hummed tunes she had sung in her village long ago, rhythms that had comforted others during illness. The child responded, moving slightly, her eyes flickering with recognition and warmth. The maid smiled softly, feeling a sense of relief and accomplishment. But she knew the journey was far from over. Over the next few days, the child's progress continued. She gained a little strength each day, her color returning, her movements becoming slightly more coordinated. The maid remained vigilant, observing every change, anticipating every need. She noticed that when the child was awake, she responded more to gentle conversation and soft touch than to any medicine or treatment. It was a lesson she had learned long ago. Sometimes, care and attention could heal what medicine could not. The billionaire, observing from a distance, began to understand this truth. He asked the maid for advice, listened carefully, and allowed her to make small decisions regarding the child's comfort and daily care. He had learned to trust her instinct, which had proven correct time and time again. It was a humbling experience for a man accustomed to controlling everything around him. One evening, the child experienced another sudden drop in her condition. Her breathing became erratic, and the monitors signaled alarms. The doctors were concerned, but the maid remained calm. She guided the staff through gentle adjustments, rearranged the child's position, and whispered reassuring words. Hours passed in tense silence, the mansion holding its collective breath. Slowly, the child stabilized once more. The billionaire watched silently, awe and gratitude filling him. He realized that her dedication had become indispensable. The staff, too, began to see the maid differently. They had initially dismissed her as just another worker, someone whose opinions and actions were inconsequential. But now, they witnessed her influence, the calm authority with which she acted in moments of crisis. Some were skeptical, but even they could not deny that the child responded better when the maid was present. Over time, the bond between the maid and the child deepened. The child began to recognize her touch, her voice, and her presence as a source of comfort and safety. She attempted to speak, to smile, and even to move her small hands toward the maid. It was slow, painstaking progress, but it brought hope that had seemed impossible weeks before. The billionaire, observing this transformation, reflected on the lessons he was learning. Money and power could build walls, machines, and systems, but they could not replace human care and compassion. He saw that the maid's dedication, patience, and unwavering focus on the child had brought more progress than all his wealth and influence combined. It was a lesson in humility and humanity. One night, as the mansion grew quiet, the billionaire approached the maid. He spoke softly, a rare vulnerability in his voice. "You have given her hope," he said. "I do not know how to thank you." Maid shook her head gently, her focus remaining on the child. "I only do what I know," she said. "I have seen suffering before. I know what helps. Nothing more." He realized that this was true generosity, the kind that could not be measured in money or rewards. She sought nothing, cared selflessly, and brought life back to someone he loved more than anything in the world. Days turned into weeks, and the child continued to improve slowly. Each moment of progress was celebrated quietly, without fanfare, but it was significant. The child's laughter returned in small bursts, her weak voice attempting words, her movements becoming more coordinated. The mansion, once filled with fear and silence, now had moments of quiet joy, all because of the maid who had been overlooked and underestimated. The maid, despite the progress, remained humble. She continued to observe, to care, to notice every small detail. She understood that recovery was fragile, that hope was a delicate thread that needed constant nurturing. She moved with quiet determination, never seeking recognition, only focusing on the child's well-being. The billionaire watched, learning a lesson he had never known. He understood that the greatest treasures in life were not wealth, power, or status, but care, compassion, and the selfless acts of those who dedicate themselves to others. He realized that the maid, who had come to the mansion as an ordinary worker, had become the source of extraordinary hope. And so, the mansion continued to breathe with quiet anticipation, each day bringing small victories and moments of fragile joy. The child's life, once hanging by a thread, began to stabilize, guided by the hands, heart, and experience of someone who had nothing but the desire to care. In this fragile balance between fear and hope, the child's recovery progressed slowly, and lives were forever changed by the presence of a humble maid who became their last, and perhaps only hope. Time passed slowly, yet each day brought a sense of progress that had once seemed impossible. The child, once weak and unresponsive, was beginning to show signs of real recovery. Her small hands attempted to move with more strength. Her voice, though still faint, tried to form words, and her eyes held more light than they had in weeks. The mansion, once a place of quiet despair, now carried a sense of cautious hope, a fragile promise that life could return. The maid remained by the child's side, tirelessly observing and attending to every small need. She had grown familiar with every subtle change in the child's condition. The child's reactions to her touch, her voice, and her presence were no longer fleeting. Each smile, each attempt to speak, each flicker of awareness was a victory in itself. The maid continued to whisper stories, hum soft tunes, and adjust blankets and pillows. Knowing that these small acts of care could strengthen both the body and spirit, the billionaire watched quietly. Sometimes from a distance, sometimes standing near the doorway, he had learned a lesson about the limits of wealth and power and the importance of compassion and human connection. Each improvement in his daughter was a reminder that money could buy doctors, machines, and treatments, but it could not replace the dedication, experience, and empathy that the maid brought to her care. One day, the child managed to speak a few words, calling the maid's name. The maid's heart leapt. She knelt beside the bed, gently holding the child's hands, and encouraged her to try again. Slowly, the words became clearer, forming short sentences. The billionaire, standing behind them, could hardly believe his eyes. Tears welled up in his eyes, a mix of relief, gratitude, and awe. He realized that his daughter's life, once hanging by a thread, had been sustained not just by medicine, but by someone who had acted with pure love and care. News of the child's recovery began to spread, quietly through the household. Staff members who had once doubted the maid now watched with respect. Nurses and doctors continued their professional care, but they also began to rely on her instincts and observations. The maid, however, remained humble, never claiming credit or seeking recognition. Her focus was always on the child, on helping her regain strength, and on providing comfort whenever it was needed. The billionaire finally spoke to her privately one evening, deep gratitude in his voice. "You saved her," he said. I cannot imagine what we would have done without you." The maid shook her head gently, a soft smile on her face. "I only did what I could," she replied. "I have seen suffering before. I know small acts can make a difference." Despite her modesty, her presence had transformed the household. The child's laughter, though still quiet, became more frequent. She tried to play with small toys, interact with the staff, and even sit up with assistants. Each step was slow and careful, but every day brought a new milestone, a new reason to hope. The billionaire began to see the maid in a new light. She was no longer just a worker. She had become a lifeline, a teacher, and a guide. He observed her interactions with the child, noting the patience, attention, and love she displayed. He realized that true heroism often came from those who had little to give, but gave it wholeheartedly over the following weeks. The child's condition continued to improve steadily. The machines that once beeped incessantly began to quiet as her body grew stronger. Doctors started to reduce the intensity of medical interventions, acknowledging that her recovery was real and remarkable. The maid's methods, her gentle care and attentiveness, had become an integral part of the healing process. The bond between the maid and the child grew deeper each day. The child now reached out for her, smiled more freely, and even attempted to speak longer sentences. It was as if a small light, once dim, had been rekindled within her. The maid's unwavering dedication had brought life back into a situation that had once seemed hopeless. The billionaire, deeply moved, decided to acknowledge her efforts in a meaningful way. He offered her financial security, a comfortable place to live, and recognition for her invaluable contribution. But she declined most of it. She asked only for respect, a place where she could live with dignity, and the assurance that she could continue to care for the child as needed. Her humility and selflessness left a lasting impression on him, teaching him that some of life's greatest treasures were not measured in wealth, but in heart and character. Eventually, the day came when the child could leave the bed for short periods, sit up, and interact with the world around her. The mansion, once filled with machines, silence, and fear, was now alive with quiet joy. Laughter echoed through the halls, timid at first, but growing stronger each day. The child's family felt a sense of relief and happiness that words could not fully capture. The maid's role remained vital. Though she no longer needed to sit by the child constantly, she taught the family how to care for her, how to notice small changes, and how to provide comfort in gentle ways. Her experience, once born from hardship, had become a source of guidance for those who had all the resources in the world, but had lacked the knowledge of true care. The billionaire often reflected on the journey. He realized that while wealth could provide opportunities, it was compassion, dedication, and selfless love that could truly save a life. He had been given a profound lesson in humility and humanity, seeing firsthand how someone who had little materially could give so much in spirit and action in the months that followed. The child regained strength and health, slowly returning to normal life. The household found balance once again, but it was forever changed. The presence of the maid, her unwavering care, and the lessons she imparted had left an indelible mark on everyone. The billionaire's family learned that hope and healing could come from unexpected places, and that the greatest gifts were often invisible and intangible. The story ended not just with the recovery of a child, but with the transformation of lives. A poor maid, unnoticed by many, became the last hope for a dying child, teaching a wealthy family the true meaning of compassion, humility, and human connection. In the quiet halls of the mansion, laughter returned, hearts healed, and a bond formed that no wealth could ever replace. The maid had shown that even in the darkest times, one person's dedication and love could make all the difference, leaving a legacy that would be remembered long after the fear had faded, even after the child had regained her health. Life in the mansion did not return to the quiet, untouched routine it had once known. The experience had changed everyone inside, from the staff to the billionaire himself. The atmosphere was lighter, but it carried a new awareness, a recognition of the fragile balance between life and the care that nurtures it. The maid, who had once been invisible in the grand household, now held a position of respect. She moved quietly through the mansion, performing her duties as before, but everyone looked at her differently. The billionaire often watched her in admiration, seeing how naturally she cared for the child and noticing the patience, the skill that came from years of experience and empathy. One morning, as sunlight poured through the large windows, the child ran toward the maid with a small smile. She held a drawing she had made, her first attempt at capturing a scene from her imagination. The maid knelt, her eyes soft with warmth, and accepted the paper gently. She praised the child, encouraging her to keep expressing herself, knowing that creativity could aid recovery and strengthen the bond between them. The billionaire, observing this interaction, felt a deep sense of gratitude. He understood that he had witnessed something rare, pure, selfless form of care that had not only saved his daughter, but had also healed a part of his own heart that he had not realized was empty. The mansion, with all its luxury and power, had never offered this kind of hope and connection before. Over the following weeks, the maid helped the child return to a normal routine. She guided her in simple exercises to strengthen her muscles and coordination, encouraged her to eat properly, and helped her regain the energy that had been lost. The child's laughter grew louder, her movements more confident, and her curiosity about the world expanded. The bond between them deepened, becoming a quiet, unspoken understanding of trust and care. The billionaire began to spend more time observing the maid's work, not to question it, but to learn. He asked her questions about her methods, her observations, and the small signs she noticed in the child's behavior. She explained gently, with humility, how attention to detail, patience, and constant care could bring results that medicine alone could not achieve. Each conversation left the billionaire reflecting on the value of compassion over wealth. One day, a visiting doctor from another city came to examine the child. He was impressed by her progress and asked how it had been possible. The billionaire explained, with no hesitation, about the maid's role. The doctor listened in awe as the billionaire described her dedication, skill, and unwavering attention. Even the most advanced treatments could not have achieved what this maid had, he admitted, and the doctor's praise highlighted the extraordinary nature of her work. The child continued to regain strength and confidence each day. She began to play with other children in the household, explore the gardens, and participate in small activities she had once loved. The maid's influence was evident in every step she took. The guidance, support, and gentle encouragement had nurtured more than just physical health. It had restored her spirit and brought back the joy that had been missing. The billionaire, deeply moved, decided to show his gratitude in a way that respected the maid's humility. He offered her financial security, a comfortable place to live, and a guarantee that she could continue her work without fear of dismissal. But she accepted only what she needed for dignity and peace, declining extravagant offers. She wanted only to continue caring for the child, to provide stability and love. Without changing the simplicity of her life, months passed, and the mansion thrived in a new rhythm. The child's health had improved dramatically, her laughter now frequent, her curiosity endless. The staff had adjusted to the changed dynamic, respecting the maid's expertise and recognizing the lessons she had brought to their routines. The billionaire had learned humility, compassion, and the profound impact of selfless care. His wealth could provide tools, but it was heart and dedication that had made the difference. One quiet evening, the billionaire called the maid to his office. He looked at her with a seriousness that held gratitude and respect. "You have changed our lives," he said. "Not just my daughter's, but all of ours. We will never forget what you have done." The maid bowed slightly, her voice calm. "I only did what I knew was right. I am glad she is better." The child, sitting nearby, reached for the maid's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The billionaire watched this moment, feeling a deep understanding of something that money could never buy. He realized that life's true value lay not in possessions, but in the love, care, and dedication of those who stand by you when the world feels helpless. The mansion, once filled with anxiety and fear, now echoed with warmth, laughter, and a new sense of purpose. The maid continued her work quietly and efficiently, her presence now a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of selfless care. The child thrived under her guidance, And the billionaire learned to appreciate the true wealth of life, human connection, compassion, and the strength found in those who give without expecting anything in return. Through these experiences, the billionaire understood a truth he had never grasped before. Even the richest life is empty without love and care. And even the smallest, most unnoticed person can become the greatest source of hope. The maid, who had entered the mansion unnoticed, had become its quiet heart, the steady force that had saved a child's life and changed the course of a family forever. The story, which began with fear and despair, ended with recovery, gratitude, and a lasting bond. It was a testament to the unseen heroes, the ordinary people who perform extraordinary acts through compassion and dedication. The child's laughter, the maid's quiet presence, and the billionaire's newfound understanding marked a profound transformation. Life, fragile and precious, had been nurtured and preserved, showing that hope can come from the most unexpected places, and that love and care are sometimes stronger than the most powerful medicine or wealth.